Have you ever wondered how someone can spend decades building a massive fortune, only to lose almost everything because of a single flaw? We're not talking about a lack of intelligence, we're not talking about inexperience, and we're definitely not talking about bad luck. We're talking about something far more dangerous, something that has destroyed empires, brought billion-dollar companies to their knees, and ruined men who once seemed untouchable. Greed. And today's story reveals how even the biggest winners can become the architects of their own downfall. It all started with a man who appeared to have achieved the impossible. For decades, he worked relentlessly to build a financial empire. What began as a small business slowly grew into something extraordinary, fueled by smart decisions, discipline, and an unusual ability to spot opportunities long before anyone else could. Year after year, his company expanded, profits climbed higher, new markets opened up. His wealth grew at an astonishing pace. Investors lined up for a chance to back his ventures, competitors watched his every move, and employees believed they were working for a true business genius. From the outside, it looked like he had discovered the secret formula for success. Everything he touched seemed to turn into gold. Every investment paid off. Every expansion generated more profit. Every decision strengthened his reputation as one of the brightest entrepreneurs of his generation. As the years passed, his fortune reached levels most people could barely imagine. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. His name became synonymous with success. His empire looked solid, unshakable, untouchable, virtually indestructible. But there's a trap that often follows people when they reach the top. The longer someone keeps winning, the harder it becomes to imagine ever losing. And that's exactly what started to happen. With every new achievement, his confidence grew. With every new profit record, his belief in himself became even stronger. Little by little, he stopped believing only in his talent. He started believing in his own invincibility. And when a person begins to feel invincible, they stop seeing the risks right in front of them. What nobody realized was that the empire he had spent decades building was quietly moving toward the biggest crisis of its existence. And the most shocking part, the threat wasn't coming from competitors. It wasn't coming from the economy. It wasn't coming from the market. The threat was coming from within, from the one person who had built it all. For years, ambition was his greatest advantage. It was the reason he woke up earlier than everyone else, the reason he kept pushing forward when others gave up, the reason he took risks when nobody believed in his ideas, and the reason he built a fortune that most people could only dream about. Without ambition, he might never have gotten started. He might never have built his empire. His name might never have become a symbol of success. But there's something most people don't realize. The same force that helps someone reach the top can also be the force that brings them down. The difference lies in one thing: control. At first, his goals were simple: build a strong company, create financial security, leave behind something that would last for generations, and he did exactly that. In fact, he exceeded every expectation. His wealth grew, his influence expanded, his business entered new markets, his reputation became larger than life. He had achieved almost everything an entrepreneur could ever want, but something strange happens when a person wins for too long. Success stops feeling special. Victories become routine. What once felt extraordinary starts to feel normal. The first $1 million was exciting, the second million was thrilling too. But eventually, the numbers stopped impressing him. The satisfaction never lasted. No matter how much he achieved, it quickly faded. And without realizing it, he found himself trapped in a race with no finish line. Every goal he reached was immediately replaced by a bigger one. Every milestone became a stepping stone to the next. There was always another target, another deal, another expansion, another fortune to chase. Nothing felt like enough. No profit was large enough. No growth was fast enough. No achievement delivered the fulfillment he was looking for. And that's when ambition began to change. What had once been fuel for success slowly became an obsession. He no longer wanted to grow. He wanted to grow faster than everyone else, faster than his competitors, faster than the market itself, faster than common sense would suggest, faster than caution would allow. Speed became more important than stability. Growth became more important than security, and short-term profits became more important than long-term survival. The warning signs were everywhere, but when someone becomes obsessed with winning, they rarely notice the red flags. After all, who was going to question a man with a track record like his? Who would dare tell him he was going too far? The more success he accumulated, the less he listened. Slowly, confidence turned into overconfidence, conviction turned into arrogance, and ambition crossed a very dangerous line, the invisible line that separates great achievers from the people who ultimately destroy everything they've spent years building. The worst part? He couldn't see it. Not yet. In his mind, he was simply doing what had always worked, chasing more growth, more profit, more success, more wins, never realizing that this endless pursuit was quietly setting the stage for the biggest disaster of his life. Success can be one of the most dangerous things in the world, especially when it lasts long enough to convince someone they're incapable of being wrong. After years of winning, the businessman began to see every success as proof that he possessed a special gift. A gift for business, a gift for spotting opportunities, a gift for making the right call when everyone else got it wrong. In his mind, there was no doubt. His companies thrived because of his decisions. His investments succeeded because of his vision. His profits grew because he could see opportunities that others simply couldn't, and with every victory that belief grew stronger. Eventually, it became more than confidence. It became certainty. And that's when everything started to change. The careful decision-maker who had built an empire slowly became someone willing to take bigger and bigger risks. At first, those moves seemed completely reasonable. The company entered new markets, expanded operations, launched ambitious projects, acquired smaller competitors. From the outside, it looked like a masterclass in growth. And to be fair, the strategy seemed to be working. Revenue climbed. Profits surged. The company's valuation skyrocketed. Investors were thrilled. The media praised his vision, and anyone looking from the outside would have assumed he was making all the right moves. But behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. With every expansion came more risk. With every acquisition came more complexity. With every investment came greater exposure. The empire was growing larger, but it was also becoming more fragile. The problem was that almost nobody talked about it. Because when the numbers are going up, people tend to ignore what's happening underneath. Success has a remarkable ability to hide weaknesses, and that's exactly what happened. Strong results created an illusion of safety, an illusion that didn't match reality. The businessman began to believe he could keep raising the stakes because he always found a way to win. If an investment looked risky, he approved it. If an acquisition seemed overpriced, he pushed forward anyway. If a project appeared too ambitious, he embraced the challenge. Little by little, calculated decisions turned into dangerous bets, and the more money he made, the more comfortable he became with risking even more. Inside the company, some people started getting nervous. Experienced executives noticed that growth was accelerating faster than the organization could safely handle. Consultants presented reports highlighting potential vulnerabilities. Analysts warned about rising debt levels and increasing financial exposure. But their concerns were rarely taken seriously, because there was one question that ended every debate. If we're making this much money, what's the problem? And that was the trap. Today's profits were hiding tomorrow's risks. While everyone was celebrating record-breaking results, a time bomb was quietly being assembled. Piece by piece, decision by decision. Risk by risk, but he couldn't see it. Not anymore. After so many years of success, he had started to believe that his experience outweighed the opinion of any expert. Anyone who raised concerns simply didn't understand what he understood. At least, that's what he thought. What he failed to realize was that he was entering extremely dangerous territory, because there comes a point when confidence stops being an advantage and becomes overconfidence. There comes a point when courage stops being a strength and becomes recklessness. Without realizing it, he had already crossed that line. The only reason nobody noticed was because the market hadn't sent the bill yet. But when it finally arrived, the cost would be far greater than anyone could have imagined. There's a saying in the business world: problems rarely arrive all at once. Most of the time they creep in slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And that's exactly how this story began. For years, extraordinary profits had hidden every weakness inside the company. As long as money kept flowing in, nobody paid much attention to the warning signs appearing along the way. Why would they? The company was thriving. Revenue was strong, investors were happy, and the empire seemed larger than ever. But no growth cycle lasts forever. Sooner or later, reality always collects its debt. And when the market began to shift, the first cracks started to appear. At first, they seemed harmless. A slight drop in sales here, an unexpected rise in costs there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that appeared capable of threatening an empire of that size. After all, the company had faced challenges before, and every time it had come back even stronger. But this time was different. The economy wasn't creating the same opportunities it once had. Competitors had become smarter, faster, more efficient. New players entered the market with business models that were leaner and more adaptable. Markets that once seemed limitless began to slow down. And some of the investments that promised spectacular returns failed to deliver. For the first time in years, things weren't going according to plan. From the outside, the numbers still looked respectable. Most people couldn't see anything wrong. But behind closed doors, concern was growing. Profit margins were shrinking month after month, operating costs continued to rise, and the debt accumulated during years of aggressive expansion was starting to weigh heavily on the company's finances. What once looked like a brilliant growth strategy was beginning to look alarmingly fragile. The deeper analysts dug into the numbers, the more worried they became. Senior executives tried to raise concerns. Some recommended reducing risk. Others suggested slowing expansion and strengthening the company's financial position before moving forward. But those suggestions were met with resistance, because admitting the need to slow down meant admitting that something was wrong, and he wasn't ready to accept that. In his mind, the problem wasn't excessive risk, it wasn't the debt, it wasn't the underperforming investments. The solution seemed simple: if profits were shrinking, grow faster. If results were disappointing, invest more. If the market was changing, seize even bigger opportunities before the competition could. It was the same formula that had worked countless times before. The same formula that had built his empire. But there was one critical difference. Back then he was running on solid ground. Now he was running across a structure that was beginning to collapse beneath his feet. The problem was that he couldn't see it. Not yet. And the more challenges appeared, the more aggressive his decisions became. The greater the risk, the bigger the bet. It was like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on the flames. And then came the moment that changed everything. The most dangerous decision of his entire career. He had a choice: pull back, protect what he had spent decades building, reduce risk, strengthen the foundation. Instead, he chose to double down. He convinced himself that one big win would solve everything. One massive success, one breakthrough deal, one more victory. But what happened next would prove the exact opposite, because sometimes the biggest mistake isn't ignoring warning signs, it's believing you're too successful to be affected by them. And that belief was about to cost him a fortune that had taken a lifetime to build. And then it happened, the moment nobody thought was possible. For years, the businessman had ignored warnings, brushed aside advice, and convinced himself that his experience was enough to overcome any obstacle. But eventually a day came when even he could no longer control what was unfolding. The market turned, and this wasn't a temporary slowdown. It wasn't a brief setback. It was a storm powerful enough to expose every weakness that had been hidden for years. Sales began to decline, at first slowly, almost unnoticed, then faster, much faster. Customers cut spending. Contracts weren't renewed. New business opportunities vanished. The money that had once flowed effortlessly into the company suddenly became harder and harder to find. But that was only the beginning. The investments that were supposed to generate massive returns started producing massive losses. Projects once described as strategic breakthroughs became financial black holes. The very initiatives that were meant to fuel growth, were now draining millions from the company. And that's when reality finally came knocking. Banks became nervous. Lenders demanded additional guarantees. Credit lines that once seemed unlimited suddenly came under review. Business partners began questioning whether the company could meet its obligations. The trust that had taken decades to build started to disappear. And when trust disappears, problems tend to multiply very quickly. Investors who once praised his vision began questioning his judgment. Analysts who had celebrated his growth now pointed out serious flaws in his strategy. For the first time, the market saw what had been hidden beneath the surface for years. The empire was far more fragile than anyone realized. Almost overnight, the company entered a dangerous downward spiral. The worse the results became, the harder it was to find solutions. The harder it became to find solutions, the more confidence disappeared. And the less confidence people had, the bigger the problems became. It was a vicious cycle, one that consumed everything in its path. Projects were shut down, expansion plans were cancelled. Ambitious initiatives were abandoned. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. Entire departments were eliminated. Valuable assets were sold off in desperate attempts to raise cash. Every sale felt like another piece of the empire being dismantled. Every cut revealed just how serious the situation had become, and all the while he watched it happen. The man who had once been celebrated as a symbol of success now watched his fortune shrink before his eyes. What had taken decades to build was disappearing in a matter of months. But the most painful part wasn't the money. It was the realization. The crisis hadn't destroyed his empire. It had exposed it. It revealed weaknesses that had been there all along. For years, profits had hidden the mistakes. Strong results had masked the risks. Rapid growth had created the illusion that everything was under control, but the truth was very different. The excessive debt, the aggressive bets, the overconfidence, the relentless need for more. All of it had been building quietly in the background. Year after year, decision after decision, risk after risk, like a massive dam filled with tiny cracks. From the outside, it looked strong, unbreakable. But inside, it was getting closer and closer to collapse. And when the pressure finally increased, the structure couldn't hold. The empire didn't fall because of a single mistake, and it didn't collapse because of a single crisis. It fell because for years, decisions had been made that prioritized short-term gains over long-term security. Decisions that looked brilliant when everything was working, but became devastating when conditions changed. And as he watched his fortune disappear, he finally understood a lesson that many people learn too late. The thing that destroys great wealth is rarely a lack of opportunity. More often, it's the inability to recognize your own limits before it's too late. By the time the crisis was over, very little remained of the empire that once seemed unstoppable. Companies had been sold, projects had vanished, investments had been wiped out, and a fortune that took decades to build had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. But looking back, the businessman realized something surprising. His greatest loss wasn't financial. It wasn't the billions of dollars that disappeared. It wasn't the businesses that collapsed. And it wasn't even the damage to his reputation. The greatest loss was realizing that much of it could have been avoided. For years he believed his success was the result of intelligence alone. He believed experience would protect him from making serious mistakes. He believed that because he had won so many times before, he would continue winning forever. But life has a way of teaching lessons. And the most valuable lessons are often the most expensive. It was only after everything began to fall apart that he finally understood a truth he should have learned much earlier. Ambition was never the problem. Ambition built the empire. Ambition created the opportunities. Ambition fueled the success. The problem was allowing ambition to evolve into greed, because there's a huge difference between wanting to grow and believing you'll never have enough. There's a huge difference between pursuing opportunity and taking risks that could destroy everything you've built. And there's a huge difference between confidence and overconfidence. It was somewhere within that difference that his fortune disappeared. The dangerous thing about greed is that it rarely looks like a flaw. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive wearing a warning label. Instead, it disguises itself as courage, as vision, as determination, as relentless ambition. And that's why so many intelligent people fall into the same trap. They don't realize when they've crossed the line. They don't notice when the desire for more begins to threaten what they already have. And by the time they finally see it, it's often too late. Maybe that's the biggest lesson in this entire story. True success isn't just about building wealth. It's about protecting it. It's not just about winning. It's about knowing when chasing one more victory isn't worth the risk. Because building a fortune requires hard work. Discipline, sacrifice, courage. But keeping a fortune requires something even rarer. Wisdom. And wisdom begins with understanding a simple truth. No person is too successful to fail. No company is too powerful to collapse. And no empire is too big to fall. The names may change. The countries may change. The industries may change. But the lesson remains the same, generation after generation. When greed takes control, even the greatest fortunes in the world can disappear. And maybe the most important question isn't about this businessman at all. Maybe it's about us. How many warning signs have we ignored? How many times have we assumed today's success guarantees tomorrow's future? How many times have we mistaken confidence for invincibility? They're simple questions, but the answers have the power to change lives, and sometimes they have the power to change destinies. And that's the story of a man who spent decades building a fortune, only to watch it unravel in just a few short years. A story that reminds us of something important. The biggest failures rarely begin with a dramatic collapse. They begin with small decisions, small compromises, small risks. The kind that seem harmless at first, but over time, they stack up one after another until they become something impossible to control. So the next time you hear someone say, they've never lost, remember this story, because the real danger isn't losing. The real danger is believing that losing could never happen to you, and that's often where the downfall begins. Now, if you've watched all the way to the end, I want you to leave a comment below and write, "Greed always has a price." I want to see how many of you stayed with this story from beginning to end. And more importantly, I want to know your thoughts. Do you think this empire could have been saved, or was its collapse inevitable? If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button. It helps the channel reach more people and allows us to keep creating stories about business, money, massive fortunes, spectacular failures, and the decisions that changed history forever. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week, we bring you new real-world stories from the world of business and finance. Stories about incredible success, unexpected failures, and the lessons hidden behind both. Because understanding how fortunes are built is important, but understanding how they're lost can be even more valuable. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.